Divine Rising New Earth, everybody. My name is Annika.
I'm Callista.
Welcome or welcome back. It is spooky season. It is Halloween. We are in the vibe. We are in the energy. We love a touch of witchiness, a touch of spooky, scorpionic, diving into the depths. And today we have a very spooky episode for you. We are going to be diving into the philosophical text, The 7 Sermons to the Dead. So, get cozy, dim the lights. If you are easily spooked, you can leave the lights on because we're going to get into it. So, Callista, will you tell us about this text and why we wanted to talk about it today?
Yes. Okay, so 7 Sermons to the Dead by Carl Gustav Jung. Carl Jung, many of you may have heard of him. Jung is how to spell his last name if you want to look him up. He is a hugely influential psychologist and esoteric philosopher who studied a lot about dreams, symbols, the subconscious, the unconscious, and all that those fields entail and beyond. And this text is, I would say, unique. It is kind of like a channeled visionary text where in the intro it says he had these visions, and he wrote this text that I would describe as like esoteric metaphysics, basically. And he's basically describing how the universe is set up with like God, man, good, evil, so on and so forth, and kind of laying out that whole picture. I have to give a shout out to my esoteric philosophy lecture online discussion group, where I first listened to and discussed this text as an audiobook. And it was really influential to me because I think this picture that Jung paints metaphysically resonates with me a lot as making sense. The pieces are falling into place and it seems true enough to me. And it's a very dense and interesting text. And it is very esoteric. Me and my philosophy group were joking, like, we should have recorded this discussion because there's like no analysis of this text that we could find online. And this would have been like one of the few analyses available for any like people who were curious. That Annika and I are discussing it in this episode. Hopefully this can be a reference to anyone curious about this text at all, because there's not a lot out there about it. And it's just a fascinating text. Annika listened to it. I listened to it again, and we are going to discuss it.
Mm-hmm. You can listen to it on YouTube.
Shout out Master Key Society. Amazing yes. YouTube channel. Library of esoteric texts. These videos are amazing. They are scanned esoteric texts page by page read out loud. So you can go on there and there's a whole library and you can read along with a scanned copy of the actual text as the narrators of this channel are reading out loud. So thank you guys.
Yeah, we love you.
So this is 7 sermons. It's like, oh, the dead came and knocked on my door in the middle of the night and they said, tell us what God of the universe is and man and evil and good, basically. And this is what I told them. Is like the setup of this book. We're not going to get too much into the context.
Yeah, that is kind of the idea. He's telling them about the construction of reality itself. And they're kind of freaking out because, like, they're Christians who believe in there being one God. And then this guy is saying, no, this God you believe in is actually one of the many, essentially. And there is even a force above that. So you can get into that if you listen to it. But essentially, the 7 sermons begin with talking about the pleroma, which pervades all things. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the pleroma?
Yes. Okay, so I feel like Jung lays out in this text a picture of reality, so to speak, that you can view in almost layers from like most to least differentiated and like distinct. And he talks about distinctiveness a lot in the text. So the pleroma is everything and nothing at the same time. It's both fullness and emptiness. It's infinite and ineffable, no thinking and no being. Both being and non-being as concepts are encompassed and cancel each other out within the pleroma. There is no way whatsoever for us as humans to think about or conceptualize or describe the pleroma. And he even says, why even talk about it? Because it's a starting point. And because as aspects of creation, creatura, the entire creation, and as beings within that, our nature is distinctiveness. That's what he says. So our nature is to distinguish. And that's why we are even having this conversation in the first place. And so that's why we do our best to distinguish the pleroma, although it is totally impossible. Then you have the creatura is all of creation, and it is the one thing that is fixed and certain because it has qualities and it is quality itself. And this is a quote. Created beings come to pass, not creatura, since created being is the very quality of the pleroma as much as non-creation, which is the eternal death. So creatura is basically the essence and the concept and all of creation eternally itself, like I said, is balanced out and canceled out by eternal death and void within the pleroma.
Yeah, so essentially, creatura takes on a quality, whereas nothing within the pleroma can have a quality because its equal and opposite is right there next to it, canceling each other out and making it void. So the second it comes out to be distinguished, almost like I'm this end of the polarity or I'm that end of the polarity, all of a sudden you're creation and you fall under creatura.
Correct.
Yeah.
So basically any qualities of the pleroma that we could perceive would be pairs of opposites. So like Annika was talking about, these polarity spectrums that oppose and nullify each other are the only things that we are able to like project to like conceptualize the pleroma. And then goes on to say, oh yeah, man distinguishes qualities of the pleroma from his own nature. Therefore, he must speak of qualities of the pleroma which are not. So like when we are describing these qualities and attributing them to the pleroma, the nature of the pleroma is that it has no qualities whatsoever. So the nature of creatura is distinctiveness. We die in such measure as we do not distinguish. Hence the natural striving of the creature goes toward distinctiveness, fights against primeval perilous sameness. So it's this idea of like to be is to be unique. And to merge,
that's a great quote.
Merge is to dissolve. So that is kind of what he is saying. And distinctiveness, he says, does not mean difference, because difference is the opposite of sameness. Not your thinking, but your being is distinctiveness. Therefore, not after difference must ye strive, but after your own being. So your distinctiveness isn't about being different from everyone else. It's about being who you are.
Yeah. So it's like not something you have to think about. It's just an authentic expression of your own energy that's beyond the mind, essentially.
It's not defined in reference to anything else. It's not different from blah, 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 blah. It's distinct. So that's all in the first sermon. And the last line of the first sermon, he's basically saying thinking separates you from being. So you need to learn to master your thought. Because he's saying, not after difference must ye strive, but after your own being. He's basically saying, like, our essence is our distinctiveness. And to embody that as much as possible, what do we pursue? Our own being. How do we do that? We remove the obstacle. What is the obstacle? The thinking mind. So to fulfill our divine essence, we need to learn to master our thoughts so we can embody our true being.
Yeah, completely. There's this Rumi quote, which I think I've mentioned on the podcast before, that's like, there's a field out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing. I'll meet you there. And it's kind of this idea that from your own essence, from your own being, the way you are inspired to be and do and act is going to be beyond like a concrete idea of like right and wrong, pretty and ugly, like all of these like two pairs of opposites. And that is how you are. That's how it says you like deliver yourself, how you redeem yourself essentially is who you are and how you be. It's like beyond these ideas of wrongdoing and right doing or any category or label that one could put on you. It just is. And like it is correct because it is the essence of your own divinity essentially.
Absolutely. And then the dead in his narration, the Peanut Gallery says, well, what about God? And he says, well, God is the creatura. God is the manifestation of the effective fullness of the pleroma, whereas the devil is the effective void or emptiness. Inseparable opposite of God, it is destruction, whereas God is generation. It is the void where God is the sun, the star. And what do these forces share? Their effectiveness. So God is the effective fullness, creation. Devil is the effective void, destruction. So he calls effectiveness abraxas. Abraxas, a God above God. Force, duration, change. So both abraxas and the pleroma are reminding me of the Tao. We had a really good episode of Brainwash Yourself called Diving into the Tao. But Jung goes on to say that abraxas is the mother of good and evil. As splendid as the lion in the instant it strikes down its victim. You get it. When you fall into good and bad, the instant of the lion striking down its victim makes no sense. Is this, suffering? Is this survival? Is this brutality? Is this magnificence? And then he says to resist it not is redemption. That is what was reminding me of the Tao Te Ching especially.
No, I love that part so much. And I think just another way to think about it. So we have the destructive force, like the devil. We have the generative force, God. And they're both effective in their opposite ways of moving energy. Whereas what's above it, abraxas, is effect itself. Like if there's an effect, that is abraxas. There is like no way to define the effect, whereas like God and the devil have a specific quality of effectiveness to them. So that's why it's like pleroma, abraxas, devil, God, and then we'll keep going from there.
Exactly. And abraxas to us is the whole world. Abraxas is the appearance and the shadow of man. It is illusory reality. And that is like that Tao God. Like there's that Christian idea of God as all good. That's kind of this idea of God, the generative fullness in a way, although increasingly distorted over time, of course. And then there's the confusion of, well, if God's all powerful and all good, then like where is this death and suffering? And then some people come to this idea of like a higher power or like this force that is kind of like moving things along from some greater perspective, where our human idea of like good and evil and death and suffering doesn't really apply. And that is kind of this idea of abraxas, of this force that is kind of moving along. And so that's kind of this like all-encompassing everything from our perspective. The reason why it's not actually everything in the pleroma is because it is paired and canceled out by this trait of ineffectiveness, which I think is super, super interesting when he says the abraxas, the effectiveness, can fully unfold completely unobstructed because it's only opposed by the ineffective. Mm-hmm. So that's why that abraxas God force is omnipotent, even though it's not unopposed. The essence of everything in opposition to that is essentially ineffective.
So it's nothing that we could witness or experience or even know.
Or could ever succeed in ever, opposing this abraxas force. That is effectiveness itself.
Yes. Yeah, so one other thing I was thinking when we were talking about abraxas, and it says, so if abraxas is everything in phenomenal reality, which essentially is a lot of the Eastern religions, their idea of God, it's not the same as a lot of Western religions' idea of God, and it does encompass violence, it does encompass terror, it does encompass all of these human qualities that sometimes aren't attributed to God in all spaces and places. And yeah, I feel like that aligns with what we were talking about in the Tao, that it's like just this force. It's this balance of all things, and it's everything that is experienced. And it's the whole idea that there's nothing good or bad. Thinking makes it so. It's all just the movement of life itself. And I loved all the things he said. For abraxas, to look upon it is blindness. And it's the whole idea, like when we were talking about the Tao, which is, do you feel like it's abraxas?
Well, it's really fascinating because, so it says, the mother of good and evil. I think so.
Yeah. So to look upon it is blindness. So like to try to look at it and to try to see it. To know it is sickness, because it's like that's not our nature, I feel like, as humans, to be able to know, to actually know it and fully conceive of it. To worship it is death. That one I thought was really interesting. That like you don't need to worship this force, but to fear it is wisdom. That I also thought was really interesting. And my favorite, again, as you said, was to resist it not is redemption, which is basically like when you just like let yourself surrender to the Tao, surrender to the way of things, to the unfolding of life, like that is ultimately your redemption. I think of that often, that especially in the realms of people who are into spirituality, the evolving of consciousness, like all these things, sometimes it feels you can get caught up in the trap of trying to get somewhere, but ultimately the path to redemption is to just resist nothing and move through your life with the alignment of your own beingness. Like that is the ultimate key and the ultimate path.
Mm-hmm. And I loved what you were saying too, and it was reminding me, I was thinking a lot of the goddess Kali, the Hindu goddess Kali, and how she is the creator and the destroyer, and how that reverence for death and destruction has its place in life, and to give it that place is so healthy and important, and something that, depending on what kind of energetic environment you grew up in, you might have to like learn to embrace and become more comfortable with, because it's something that people fear because of its power. So we have abraxas, then we have what he describes as God, the godson, the beginning, and then the devil, the destroyer. And then these are two of what he calls four principal gods. The other two are what he calls these two god devils, Eros and the tree of life. So Eros joins two into one. It expands and illuminates. It is the burning one, the flame. It gives light. It consumes. It dies. And then the tree of life is filling space with bodily forms. It gives substance, the growing one. It buds. It heaps. It grows slowly and constantly. So we have the beginning, the Eros, which is this flame joining burning force, the tree of life, growing, giving substance, and then destruction and death. So these are these 4 principal gods that he names.
Yeah. Onwards.
So he goes on to then describe the celestial world and the earth world. So he says that the celestial world is formed by these bright gods. Their nature is to magnify. They're made manifest in spirituality. The earth world is formed by dark gods whose nature are to diminish and are made manifest in sexuality. And he says spirituality is this force that conceives like mental forms and embraces or supports, and calls it the spiritual mother. Sexuality, the earthly father, is this force that engenders, which means to cause, and creates physical form. So you have this interplay of the earthly father. Sexuality can engender or cause something that then conceives with the force of the celestial spiritual mother, this mental energetic form that then the energy of the earthly father substantiates, creates in the physical, and then the energy of the spiritual mother comes back in to support and embrace this creation. So the spiritual mother and the celestial world are infinitely spreading and increasing, and the earthly father, the earth world, are infinitely diminishing and declining. But that's the interplay of creation, polarity.
It's always happening in equal and opposite fashion, not one more than the other. Yeah. And that's like what keeps, I feel like, the world existence as we know it together is like this perfect opposition of polarity. It's like the balance of the forces of reality.
Exactly. And he goes in to discuss sexuality and spirituality. A lot of this I just put in as food for thought. Sexuality of man is more of the earth. Sexuality of woman is more of the spirit. The spirituality of man is more of heaven. It goes to the greater. The spirituality of the woman is more of the earth. It goes to the smaller. Lying and devilish is the spirituality of the man, which goes to the smaller, and the spirituality of the woman that goes to the greater. Man and woman become devils to each other when they don't honor their distinctive nature by dividing their spiritual and sexual ways.
That I found so interesting.
I found that interesting too, because in our society today, it is an interesting hot topic. Men, women, the distinctiveness, if any. And I did have that come to my mind when I was reading this, and I did want to reference something he mentioned earlier about abraxas as being hermaphroditic. There's no erasure of the fact that there are realities that exist beyond these two distinct essences. And within all of us, both of these essences, I think within every facet of creation, are playing out. But I also do think that people are throwing the baby out with the bathwater to a big extent with a lot of the narrative around these topics, and that it is extremely powerful and has been for me to connect into feminine energy, female biology, and things like this, the distinctiveness of what it is to be a woman, exactly the words he is saying and whatnot. What were your thoughts on them?
Well, you know what's it's bringing to mind for me that is so interesting? Okay, so basically, he said the qualities belong to the pleroma, and only in the name and sign of distinctiveness can and must we possess or live them. But then he says we must distinguish ourselves from qualities. In the pleroma, they are balanced and void. In us, not. Being distinguished from them delivereth us. When we strive after good and beautiful, we therefore forget our own nature, which is distinctiveness, and we are delivered over to the qualities of the pleroma, which are pairs of opposites. So that part kind of confused me, because I thought he was basically saying that like these qualities only live through us distinguishing them, like kind of owning one or like one side of the polarity or the other. But then he says like, no, you have to distinguish yourself from the quality completely, because if you do strive after one end or the other, you'll actually activate both and they'll be null and void. So I was kind of confused. That was one of the questions I had for you. And then here where he's talking about being distinctive between the male and female energies, it's like, if we gravitate towards one, are we not doing what he's saying not to do in distinguishing ourselves from the quality completely?
Well, okay, so the first one, he's saying don't identify with one end of the polarity. In the pleroma, you can't even see good or evil playing out because they are totally canceled out. Mm-hmm. Within yourself, you can see good and evil playing out because you have the contrast of, for example, more good than evil. But that doesn't mean you're good. Mm-hmm. That's what he's saying.
Got it.
He's saying as soon as you're good, you may as well be evil.
Got it. Got
it. That's why you're even seeing this goodness in the first place. And then the second thing you said, this is really interesting too, because we've talked about masculine and feminine energies in the past. This text is from 1913, okay? And we're going into the age of Aquarius, New Earth, 5D, 2024. So these esoteric texts, not that 1913 is extremely ancient, it's so important to be informed and to apply the technology to your context. I think that this might be one of these situations where if Jung was here, only wish he was, he might break this down a lot further when it comes to man, woman. Because Jung is not, I read a book by Jung, the only other text I've read by him, Man and His Symbols. A whole foundational understanding of his work is that masculine and feminine energies play out within every single man and woman. Mm-hmm. He's no stranger to that. Mm-hmm. So I think
this is like very big picture and like we could go deeper. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. But I feel like overall it had an interesting message of like, I actually thought it was fascinating to think about the man. His spirituality is like of the heavens, women's spirituality is like more of the earth. Like I was like, maybe if we're just thinking about it energy wise, the like witchy woman empress connected to the elements, connected to the natural world, like this like incredible frequency, and then the man like more mental, connecting to the higher realms, this God that lives out there, whereas the woman like feels it in her body. And it doesn't have to be man woman, but it could just be like kind of masculine feminine energy thing versus like the sexuality. The man, it's like very physical for him. Like, you know, you can get like just, you know, turned on by like rubbing against something, you know, it's like such a real carnal experience. Whereas for the woman, actually it even says in the yogic teachings that it's like it's a much more higher center thing. Like I think it's like, I can't remember exactly where it is, but it's like the woman gets turned on starting in the pineal or pituitary gland. Like it's very much like we receive the signal up here and we can still get turned on and have these like a totally orgasmic experiences, but it starts from a higher place, like almost like a higher chakra place versus like a lower chakra place, even though it ends up like encompassing it all. And I think that it does make sense that this would be like more the masculine frequency and the feminine frequency versus just like man woman, because I think there are a lot of women who can resonate to having like the masculine sexual experience that I just referenced, and then maybe some women who resonate more with having this other type of experience, and we probably all have had a little bit of both. But I think that's why it has to do maybe a little bit more with energetics, but in this text is talking strictly about it.
I think that's exactly right. I think Annika just explained it all. And in the New Earth, we want to balance our internal masculine and feminine, or like if you want to use a way of speaking, like your internal man and woman. But at the same time, when it comes to this distinctiveness, we all have kind of like an organic, internal, natural balance. And I think that's what he's talking about of it's lying and devilish to pretend to be the opposite, and that man and woman become devils to each other when they do so. So I think it is just about honoring and being yourself. I think the way Annika just explained it, like those frameworks are really helpful in just seeing like how you operate and how that might be different from someone else, and that's okay. And it's actually like that polarity of being different that makes it harmonious, and trying to force something that you're not by putting some virtue on how someone else distinctively operates is toxic.
This makes a lot of sense. And also how we talked about distinguishing yourself from the qualities, because if you're in touch with your inherent beingness, your authentic essence, at like baseline, it's going to be like a certain combination of these energies. And so like if you're naturally being in that essence and you're not trying to force yourself into something that you're not, then you're going to match up with somebody who's a polar, like, complement to that energetic kind of amalgamate that's happening within you naturally. And that is how you would have, like, the harmonious, redemptive interaction with somebody else versus, I don't remember what he said, one where you're like, because it's basically like, it's so interesting because it's, this whole thing is about almost going beyond a limited conception of right, wrong, evil, good, like all these polarities. And it's basically saying that the most correct thing is just to be as you are and let everything be as it is in a way.
I think so. And I also thought it was interesting. It says, distinguish yourself from spirituality and sexuality and regard them as above and beyond you. You don't possess and contain them, but rather they you. Spirituality, sexuality, life, and abraxas are the common, quote, like tasks, dangers, and burdens of mankind. I would say the common, opportunities, games, and blessings of mankind. But that's what we have going on down here.
We only have a few minutes left, so shall we get into the final part, like the inner light?
Yes. Super quick, the one other last thing he said is that communion, because that's what I was wondering
this
the whole
was
time.
So interesting.
It's like, okay, but what about love, merging, marriage, friendship, like having things in common, and like that feeling of like it does reduce distinctness and creates this amalgamated, cohesive group.
And even communion with some higher power, some higher energy, because like when you go into that space, it's like
you dissolve your ego
completely.
Yes, and it's like that feels good. We like that. And so it's like, what's going on? Because he's all saying like, be distinct, be distinct, be distinct, like as if it's like, oh my God forbid that we like merge into God consciousness. Mm-hmm. But
oh my God.
He says communion is necessary to a certain extent. Without communion, suffering and sickness. But communion in everything is dismemberment and dissolution. Commune only as much as necessary, lest it interfere with your sovereignty, basically. Communion.
That's such a good way to put it.
Yes.
You're really a translator. I love this.
For your health, that your body needs it. He says no communion is suffering and sickness. So commune as much as your body needs for your physical, mental, emotional health.
But you're saying the line is like where it starts to breach with your sovereignty, which I feel like you can feel.
Well, he's actually saying just that much. Anything more does breach your sovereignty. That
is really fascinating.
And I thought this was really interesting. Yeah. Communion, depth, purification, preservation and warmth, singleness, height, purification, increase, and illumination. So these are not opposites. We have depth and height. Purification and purification I found most fascinating. Preservation and increase, and then warmth and illumination. So, and that resonates so much with me. Like, so it's all about, finding this balance. Mm-hmm. And then going on, then the dead say, okay, great. What about man? What about, the human being? And he says, man is the gateway through which ye dead have passed into the inner world from the outer world of gods, demons, and souls. The dead that he's speaking to are located in endless space in the smaller or innermost infinity. Because he said a lot at the beginning about the pleroma. We are not a part of the pleroma. The pleroma has no parts. But the pleroma is a part of us at the most deepest internal point. So dead are located in the endless space in the smaller or innermost infinity, which makes sense because everything is located in the pleroma, but not as a part of it. The pleroma is a part of us, which we are located inside. Very fascinating, very paradoxical, but don't try and conceptualize it because you cannot. And it says, The dead are located in the endless space in the smaller or innermost infinity. At immeasurable distance stands one single star in the zenith. This is the one God of this one man, his world, his pleroma, his divinity. In this world is man Abraxas, the creator and destroyer of his own world. This star is the God and the goal of man. This is his one guiding God. He says, keep your eye on this guiding star, away from the flaming spectacle of the worldly Abraxas. Weakness and nothingness to be found there. If you keep your eye on this internal guiding star, eternally creative power.
So when Callista was saying this star, it's the inner star. It's literally inside.
The inner light of your heart, your third eye,
your navel point, honestly.
This idea of the North Star, your guiding light, your heart's desire, your wish, your heart's wish dream come true. When you wish upon the star, is what you are following. And how relatable is that? We all know the truth of that. It's when you're chasing for validation from the world. In Islam, they call it the dunya. That's what this is saying. Like, there's this quote, I don't know what it is from Islam, but it's basically like, let your heart beat for Allah, not the dunya. That's what this is saying. The dunya is the endless cycle of what
it's the Maya on. The dream versus, your own inner light, which is why so many schools of thought will talk about not looking for God without, but looking for God within, because it is this force that is ultimately within you. I mean, and this can connect to so many things, the Kundalini energy is like known to be within you, and like they say that like God lives within the spine, and then there's also so many teachings about like the navel point being the source of like all of your life force. And it is this idea that almost like, which I feel like we talk about in this podcast so much, it's like not being attached to even informed by or so connected to where you're deeply affected by this external reality, because you're essentially spinning your own universe. And what he's also saying is that like that is the ultimate source of your redemption. Like, you're not going to find your redemption from a God that's outside of you. You're going to find it from, following that light within. And also he talks about like increasing that light within. So it is increasing your own energy, increasing the expression of your own soul, letting it guide you, and then also like tending to that inner flame. We've talked a lot about being a flame keeper. It's like keeping this flame alight within you, and that being the ultimate way that you can serve yourself and then serve others, is to stoke that flame, and then it is contagious.
Yeah, it's like this holy divine flame, and that's also what connects all of us to each other at the deepest level. To go further and further toward each other is to go further and further away from each other, because you're running away from the true source of your union with another. And it ties in as well so much to these ideas of quantum physics and metaphysics and like science and dimensions and whatnot that are also so fun to think about. And the way that we love to explain them as humans is like, think of a dot, then a line, then a square, then a cube, and then a cube over time. And it's like, okay, now think of the cube over time as a dot. And then if that dot was a line, what would that be like? To like try and get our minds up into these dimensions that we can't conceptualize or perceive with our physical senses. And it like almost has this energy of going up and out and up and out. But actually that is such like a reflective, inverse way of describing it, because to actually experience the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, all the way up to the most infinite dimension is to go deeper, 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 deeper into the heart center, period.
Yeah, I love it so much. So it was a fun conversation to have. I feel like there are some like practical things in there in terms of, as much as you can, sinking into your own essence, letting your own light and your own soul guide you, having this healthy balance between communion and singularity, like distinguishing yourself and just being sovereign and one with yourself, and then also building up your own spiritual light. I mean, there are so many ways to do this, you know. I mean, I feel like, honestly, practical things for that are breath work, kundalini yoga, just like living life in accordance to the guidance of your own soul. I think will continue to like build that light.
I would say, especially when it comes to Jung, these texts, it's like the magic, the mystery, the symbology, the deep meaning are at least as valuable as anything practical.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, thanks for being with us. 7 Sermons to the Dead. Happy spooky season.
The veil is thin.
The veil is thin.
Tap in.
Tap in. Let's leave it at that. Flourish.